Prison is just an obstacle, James Scott said. The game of life is easy. The winner is the one who overcomes obstacles, but you don't have to play. You could cop out. You could die. James Scott was an incarcerated boxer whose story blurred the lines between redemption and false hope. It is a story of one man's desperate battle to keep from being known simply as James Scott was born on October 17, 1947, in Newark, New Jersey, and was the eldest of 10 children. Ours was a typical black family, Scott said. My mother was on welfare. The marriage broke up, so the children sought an image elsewhere. I wasn't attracted to pimps or narcotic dealers. I was attracted to the gangs and their leaders. Scott would drop out of school in the 7th grade. At 13, he would be arrested and sent to the Jamesburg Home for Boys on the charge of truancy. For the next 5 years, he ricocheted around different New Jersey juvenile reformatories like Annandale and Bordentown. These reform schools had boxing programs, and the sport became something Scott could focus on.
I had never been in prison before, and I was forced to do what anybody else had to do, survive.
Did you actually learn how to fight in prison?
Yes.
What circumstances? When?
Okay, I got my first pair of gloves when I was 10 years old. I was on the streets, my uncle gave them to me. My father showed me a little bit about boxing, but he never really spent time with me. Okay, and I went to Jamesburg. In Jamesburg, it's mandatory that you fight or you learn how to box, because that's a status symbol. Right? So, the prison is a world too. So you try to get status so you learn how to box. I went to Annandale. They had boxing gloves in Annandale, and they had matches in Annandale, 3-minute rounds. Right, so we boxed in the sandpit. When I went to Bordentown, I had my first 5 amateur fights. I won 3, I lost 2. Okay, that was my first experience. And one of the things that thrilled me is I always thought I could be a little bit better than another guy. Watching the guys do it, I thought it was a little more exciting, something that the crowd wanted to see, that slam, bang, toe-to-toe action. Okay, from Bordentown, I went to prison. The guys in prison were so good I couldn't even put the gloves on until around 66, 67. From 67 to now, I beat everything in the prison houses.
But by 1969, at the age of 22, Scott would be convicted of armed robbery and sent to Trenton State Prison. Once there, he would spend 15 months in what was called the Vroom Building, an asylum for the criminally insane.
I spent 15 months in the Vroom Building, and my training was down there. I spent 15 months down there. That's the worst place I've ever been in my life. And I spent down there, and that gave me a chance to think. I think when a man is forced with thought, under adversity, you're forced to think. That's when you begin to realize what are you going to do and what you have to do. And I think it was then that I really decided I've got to get a chance. I just got to make it, I can't quit now.
Inside the Vroom Building, he would meet Al Dickens, a former boxing champion who was serving 50 years for an armed robbery himself. Dickens took the young Scott under his wing, not only teaching him the finer points of the sweet science, but instilling the idea that boxing could be Scott's ticket to a better life. But Scott didn't listen. He would be released from prison and then immediately arrested again on another robbery charge. Sent back to the Vroom Building, Scott then decided to take Dickens at his word, and he focused on becoming a boxer. His introduction to prison boxing would be a trial by fire, as his first sparring partner would be Reuben Hurricane Carter, the now incarcerated former top middleweight contender. Scott would be one of only a few prisoners who would be able to last a full 3 rounds against the hard-hitting Hurricane. The hard-fought sessions would pay off as Scott would go on to win the state prison championship. His reputation grew to the point where prospective challengers in the prison system would turn down fights against him. By 1974, Scott would be paroled, and he set his sights on becoming a professional prizefighter. Scott called numerous fight managers and promoters around the country. Finally, a Miami architect named Murray Gabby took a chance on him. His brother Dan had political influence in New Jersey, and the two were able to get Scott paroled out of state to Florida. Scott was now 26 years old, and strolled into the Chris Dundee-owned 5th Street Gym in Miami, ready to fight. Dr. Ferdy Pacheco, a gym regular, said that Scott wasn't dressed like a fighter, coming in with basketball shoes and cut-off denims. But once he got into the ring, he knocked out a heavyweight who was a contender at the time, and Scott instantly became the talk of the gym. Scott would turn professional in 1974, defeating capable fighters like Ray Anderson and Jesse Burnett. By February of 1975, after only 1 year as a pro, he was 10-0 with 5 knockouts and 1 draw. But as one writer described it, Scott felt double-parked in the world, always boiling over with fear he was being taken advantage of and cheated. He was rude and confrontational to everyone outside the media. Scott himself admitted as much, saying, "In prison, you get 1 spoon that you keep with you in your cell, and you take it to and from meals. Lots of times in Miami Beach, I'd automatically pick up a spoon in a restaurant and put it in my pocket. And then I'd see the look on the waitress's face. In her mind, they're all the same, all thieves." But in the ring he felt at home, and the management team of Murray Gabby and Chris Dundee had trouble finding him opponents. They reached out to both light heavyweight champions, offering $100,000 to Bob Foster and John Conte. Foster refused. Conte's people took the fight under consideration, and things were finally looking up for Scott.
History is made every day. There's always new incidents arising, and this is unique. A couple of years ago, this would have been unthought of. So now, the possibilities of a prisoner getting a chance is according to his ability. I don't think that to look at the fact that he's in prison, maybe it's bad for the public image, but I think that what will shine is that his good deeds outweigh his bad deeds. All you're supposed to see is the title. The guy has won. He's a good fighter. The only people like Cosell and maybe you were, well, years ago you were in prison. What caused you? That's not important. What we're doing now. Like you got a lot of people that have done a lot of things and made a lot of mistakes. And we don't always bring up what you did in the past,
After only a year out of prison, he had earned over $15,000 through boxing. He now had his own apartment, a girlfriend, and a new blue Chevrolet. But Scott couldn't resist the call of his old neighborhood. He began driving back to Newark, New Jersey. It was a parole violation, and Murray Gabby, his benefactor, warned him not to do so. Gabby would then get a call that Scott was arrested for robbing a drug dealer and killing his accomplice. Scott would deny the charges, but his car was spotted at the scene with a dead body being thrown out of the passenger side of his vehicle. The body was identified as a drug dealer named Everett Russ. Bullet holes and blood were found in Scott's car. Scott would claim that he only loaned the car out. There would be a hung jury on the murder charge, but they weren't convinced he was innocent of the robbery that netted only $238. Now a multiple violent offender, Scott would be sentenced to 30 to 40 years. He would enter New Jersey's most notorious maximum security correctional facility, Rahway State Prison, and be locked into a 5-by-9-foot cell. His story should have ended there, but for Bob Hatrak. Hatrak was a rehab-minded prison warden. He had grown up poor and had his own dreams of being a professional baseball player end when he lost 4 fingers in an industrial accident. Hatrak approached Scott with the idea of developing a boxing program, a program which he wanted Scott to lead.
It may be the most real job training that we can offer to, I think, a significant percentage of our population, the youngster from the ghetto areas who grows up wanting to be the Willie Mays, the Muhammad Ali, and who has all the ability in the world.
The boxer would take him up on his offer. Scott said, quote, "I don't want to look back after 20 years and say all I did was make a bunch of license plates. What me and the rest of the guys in the boxing program are trying to do is go beyond rehabilitation. It's a matter of human dignity." Hatrak would give Scott a typewriter, and the fighter would begin a 3-year letter-writing campaign to have anyone give him a chance to promote his fights from inside Rahway Prison. He would call promoters like Don King and Bob Arum, but they both refused, telling Scott that his career wasn't going anywhere. But a rookie promoter named Murad Muhammad would take up his cause. Muhammad grew up in Newark like Scott and saw the potential in his story. Muhammad would manage to get 2 fights for Scott inside the prison. Scott would win, and his reward would be a steak dinner. But Muhammad knew that Scott needed press and television exposure. Serendipity hit as the fledgling HBO was looking to expand into sports in 1978, and an unlikely union was formed. HBO would agree to televise Scott's bout against #1 light heavyweight contender Eddie Gregory.
I think about this all day long, 24 hours a day. I eat, sleep, and drink this. He's got an hour in the gym, girls, he got to duck all that. All this publicity on him at one time. Psychologically, I can't see, I just can't see him being ready. And if he is ready, I'm ready. We're going to fight. And I'm going to knock him out. I want you to hear this here. I'm going to knock him out in no more than four. No more than four.
It's going to be a fight. If the other guy come in prepared to make it a boxing match, he's mistaken because he's going to be in a war.
Gregory thought of Scott as an easy $15,000 payday on HBO, while the network saw value in the novelty of having a boxing match take place inside a prison. Rahway Penitentiary had a reputation. 7 years earlier, convicts had staged a riot and took 7 people hostage, including the warden. Precautions were taken before the match, and not all 1,100 inmates were allowed to be seated in the audience. Instead, there were large screens set up in a hall where the inmates could watch the bout, even though they themselves thought little of Scott's chances to upset Gregory, who was a 4-to-1 favorite. The odds inside the prison itself were 3 cartons of cigarettes to 1 in favor of the visiting #1 contender. But once Scott entered the ring, fellow inmates began chanting his Muslim name, Rajan. Gregory stated that he felt as if he were fighting a Frenchman in Paris. Dr. Ferdy Pacheco, who had befriended Scott at the 5th Street Gym, gave the convict his final instructions before the fight. He told Scott, "Don't try to think out there. Fight by instinct. You're an animal caged up in here, and you want to get out. Go out and fight like an animal. Snarl like an animal. Climb all over him like an animal." A new boxing star was born. Judge Harold Letterman said, "On that day, I thought James Scott was the greatest light heavyweight I ever saw in my life. That's how great he was. I don't think Bob Foster was as good as that. I don't think Archie Moore was that good." Reporters and television crews now wanted his story, but Scott didn't take a moment's rest. In his words, he had to keep working like a Georgia mule under a hot sun. His daily workout regimen consisted of running through the mud of the prison yard with heavy boots, doing over 1,000 push-ups and sit-ups before repeating the cycle all over again. The television networks returned to Rahway to showcase his fights. Scott would defeat contender after contender, rising in the ratings after each victory. He was ranked at number 9, then 5, then 4, then 2. The dream was becoming a reality.
Nobody's ever went straight to the top. If you ask a college professor, how long did it take you to get here? I quote Dr. Ferdy Pacheco. One time I was getting ready to give up, and he says, you know, I used to look down a tunnel, and all I could see was a light. I didn't know what was in the tunnel. All I knew was there was a light at the end of the tunnel. I just followed that light. Nobody knows what they got to go through to get to the top. This is where I wound up going through to get to the top. But what difference does it make as long as you get there?
Of boxing's two governing bodies, only the WBA would rank Scott, as the WBC didn't acknowledge his existence. But as Scott rose up through their rankings, the WBA changed course, insisting that they would never sanction a bout with Scott for the title. Scott would then petition the court so that he could be released on bail in order to compete for the WBA version of the crown. He would be denied, as he had 4 violations in the 5 years he had been in Rahway State Prison.
You've been in prison since 1960, most of your adolescent and adult life. Why should we believe that if you became champion and can come out of prison, that you can live outside of the prison and society?
Well, first of all, you got to remember that when I was in prison, or when I was locked up, I was young. You know, I had no goals, no values. The hardest job in the institution is getting around the stuff in here. You know, you have people that are envious. You have officers that are envious who, you know, or when I say envious, you know, will do anything they can to stifle your creative abilities or stop you from being successful. I don't think it would be very, very, very hard to train for a championship fight with all the distractions in here. And I said before, you know, you find some guys, for instance, if a basketball game was scheduled and boxing is scheduled, there's a toss-up between boxing and basketball, the bag may get destroyed. So the basketball game can go on because there's a conflict of interest. You got some guys in here that can play basketball almost as good as Dr. J, but they never had a chance to be discovered. You know? And the reason why I say that is because, I mean, let's face it. All right, I got all these books in my room, so by reading and writing, I learn how to talk. Okay, now if a person spends 5 to 6 to 7 hours every day doing something, another guy spends an hour a day doing something, who has a better chance of being the best at it?
Scott said, quote, "When the people went west in the 1800s, seeking gold, they found it in the dirt. Prison is the dirtiest place in the country, but it doesn't mean the inmates shouldn't have some incentive, something to strive for. We have guys here who can write, who can fight, who can sing, who can compose. There's so much talent in here, sometimes you feel like crying." Scott's dreams would take 2 more crushing blows. Warden Robert Hatrak, who supported Scott's possible move to a minimum security prison, was demoted to a desk job in April of 1979. The new warden would be a former guard that once filed assault charges against Scott for striking another inmate with a pipe. Scott would no longer have someone advocating for him as an exceptional case, as Warden Hatrak did. Instead, he would have someone who wanted to put him in the hole. Next came a decision by the WBA officials to remove Scott completely from their rankings. Scott had ascended to the number 2 spot, and the WBA didn't want him contending for their title. Neither governing body wanted the taint of having a convicted armed robber and probable cold-blooded murderer winning their version of a world championship. Seeing the writing on the wall, Scott would retire, but the actions of the WBA made him look like a martyr. Fans and networks were still interested in his career, and Scott would change his mind on retirement, returning against the number 1 contender in YAQUI LOPEZ. With the victory, Scott would declare himself as the uncrowned champion, but they felt like empty words, as the removal of his name from the rankings made him seem invisible. Returning to the ring 5 months later, his fighting spirit seemed diminished as he took on the rugged Jerry the Bull Martin. The loss to Martin would send Scott into one last downward spiral. He would then be retried for the murder of Everett Russ, with the jury reaching a guilty verdict and sentencing him to a life in prison. With that courtroom defeat on his mind, Scott would enter his bout against Dwight Braxton as a shell of his former self. Braxton was a former Rahway inmate, once upon a time Scott's protege, and the student beat his old teacher into retirement. Scott would remain in prison for another 24 years until his release in 2005. Now 58 years old, he would be placed into a government-subsidized room in Trenton, New Jersey. Scott would spend his days volunteering in a local boxing gym before living out his final years in a nursing home where he would suffer from dementia. He would pass away in 2018. But Scott's fighting spirit died on the day of September 5, 1981, when he lost his final match. Whatever fight that was still left in him was gone the moment he exited the ring, as he knew what the defeat meant. He was no longer a player in the game of life, no longer an exceptional case. He had now become another prisoner with no way out, with dreams that had nowhere to go.